this is a conversation about a kind of a complex topic, right? This is in a way advanced alliance management. When you learn how to do one alliance, the strategy, the management of it, and then you hear or understand that what you really need are multiples or a whole ecosystem of alliances, then of course the stakes are higher in getting all of those alliances also to work well. So I would like to give you my view of it. And as Kim said, I've been working on this for many years before really we used the terms ecosystem and platforms. And I'll explain to you what I mean by those as we go along. But there are many terms out there. And what I'd like to try to do is to sort of demystify this for you. I don't think that there's anything very much more complex than understanding good alliance strategy and management and then multiplying it by many factors. So I'll show you the links between what you already know in alliance management and strategy and what this field of ecosystems and platforms requires that you know. And again, I think we'll try to demystify and define things as we go along. This is just a little bit of my background in terms of the work that I've done. And as I just mentioned to you in passing, I've been studying this idea of ecosystem or multi-partner platforms and multi-partner constellations really way back to the 1990s when I first saw that kind of phenomenon. We didn't call it ecosystems then. And in my book, Alliance Revolution, I talk about it. And I'll show you some of that early evidence. And then in my next book, we had a few cases about this kind of multi-partner management. And certainly in my most recent book, Remix Strategy, that many of you know, I have a whole large chapter on that. And then most recently, I've done 2 LinkedIn Learning courses. If you're not familiar with these, I think it's a tremendous resource, the whole LinkedIn Learning platform. They have acquired the old lynda.com platform, where you can learn really anything from how to do Excel sheets to how to manage alliances and ecosystems. And so there's an increasing number of management-oriented courses about strategy, about project management, about marketing and sales, about entrepreneurship, etc., including these 2 courses. One of them is called Strategic Partnerships, and the other one is called Strategic Partnerships, Ecosystems and Platforms. And both of them are available either from LinkedIn Learning or lynda.com, or you can also, I think, buy them individually. My website has some more information for you on how to get to those if you're not familiar with them. And so the agenda from the topics that I think we've advertised is over here for fundamentals, and then something around network advantages, very important concept. Then issues around organizing the ecosystem, and then issues around using a digital platform, which is a very specific way of organizing an ecosystem. And then issues around growing your ecosystem. And I should say, all through, and especially towards the end, there's also a question of capturing value. How do you capture value from this kind of strategy? So let's go straight into that and see what we can learn from these topics. Again, this is not moving the way. I think I should put my key on there. How's that? Okay, all right. The arrow has to be on the PowerPoint. This particular talk today is a little bit of a follow-up to the talk I gave back in October of last year on basically 5 steps to partnership success. So I'll echo some of those, and for some of you who have had that, I'll remind you what they are. And if you have not seen that particular webinar, it's available in the archive, both at ASAP as well as on my website. So that's sort of the background to what we're doing here today. Remix strategy. The word that I use, just again for those of you who are kind of new to this kind of thinking, the word really is around how do you combine capabilities, resources from different companies to create new value, very often to create innovation. And this kind of remix, this kind of combination, works really through many different types of tools. The largest, biggest ones that we hear about all the time are mergers and acquisitions, but everything from strategic partnerships, alliances, joint ventures, and ecosystems and platforms and networks are a way to combine resources from different companies, and that's, I think, the context in which we're going to be doing this. Now, in terms of the remix strategy and how you get value out of these combinations, there are really 3 of them. For me, it's a prism. I look through every merger or every joint venture or alliance or attempt to form a network through this prism. And as prisms do, they split into factors, the white light that goes into it. And the three factors that matter here are a formula that some of you have heard from me before, that you use the idea of 1 + 1 is 3, which is to create value. That's one of the factors. And then the secondary idea of 1 + 1 is 1, which is you have to get companies to work together in order to create value. You need that in order for the success to take place. And finally, you need to split that value somehow. So I call it 1 + 1 = 1.4 + 1.6, or 1.5 + 1.5. Basically, they have to add up to 3. And these are fundamental rules. I don't think you can have any kind of combination that doesn't in some way hit each one of these corners of this prism. And so the question is, these very large fundamental rules, how do you put them into practice? How do you make them so that they can in fact create value for your combination? And that's what I call the 5 steps. And again, this is a little bit of a repeat from last time. Basically, there's 5 steps. You have to set your goals. You have to understand what it is that you're trying to do and why. What is the source of value that can be created from a combination, and therefore also from a network or from an ecosystem. How do we think about the value that gets created in an ecosystem? And then there's a question of what kind of match, which partner choice would you make to create this value? And again, in an ecosystem, we have the choice of which partners to include, even how many partners to include. Same factors, just a slightly different way of analyzing it in the ecosystem case. And then the deal, or the structure of the deal. That's very standard, of course, in every alliance, that we need to think about the structure of the deal. In the case of an ecosystem, we have to think about how to organize that ecosystem. What is the structure of that large grouping, and who gives what to whom? Relationship management, which is actually sort of the dynamics of a partnership. And many of you who are living in the partnership management world, this is your job, is to manage that ongoing growth of the partnership. Same thing happens with ecosystems. We need to manage not just the relationships between players, but also the growth of the ecosystem. And as it grows, how does it change its shape? Because this is now a multiplayer system. And finally, the results, or what do you capture from that particular deal? And again, when you have a joint venture or an alliance, it's a little bit discrete. You can kind of define that. When it comes to an ecosystem, it's a bit more murky and sometimes harder to figure out how to capture value from the ecosystem. So we're going to use these same 3 rules and the same basic 5 steps to get to the core of what it takes to manage an ecosystem successfully for value. And let's step back for a moment. What is an ecosystem? So I want to just give you a little bit of a case story. It's something you know very well. Some of you remember this machine. I remember, I date myself. We used to have this in the dorm in college. And of course, how do we move from that phone system to today's phone system? It's a dramatically different way of doing communication. And the fact is that as we moved, we didn't just jump in one step. We actually moved by creating different products along the way. And each of these products had its own ecosystem to support it. And I'll show you what I mean. So basically, in the early days, and this is from my first book, which I mentioned to you, The Alliance Revolution. So this is the sort of 1996 version of an ecosystem. This particular chart shows the various alliances that existed at the time in what we called multimedia or personal digital assistants, PDAs. And if you'd recall, there were lots of alliances at that time. And in fact, the alliances kind of coalesced around certain leaders. So you had an Apple group. It was not around the iPhone, but it was around the Newton. You might remember that. And then there was an AT&T group, and then there were groups around other players, Motorola, etc. And so each of these groups competed against the other groups in order to establish a standard or create a whole value chain, if you will, around their particular product. So that's in a way the birth of the idea of ecosystems, at least in my mind. These were constellations that competed for value in a marketplace. And what happened? Well, we had different products. These are the ones that actually were in my pockets at one point or another. Some of you may remember some of them. This is my old Palm Pilot, which I still have just as an artifact to remind me of how technology has improved from that to today's phones. But each of these steps, from the flip phone to the Palm Pilot to the iPod to the BlackBerry and then to an iPhone or an Android phone, really was the creation of a new ecosystem around each of these products. In fact, there's a very good movie out that's not quite out yet called General Magic. Some of you may have heard about it. General Magic was one of the very early entrance into the idea of a personal digital assistant that was able to be communicating and had graphics on it, but it failed. And it failed because it was too early. Now, what did it mean that it was too early? It was too early because there was no supporting ecosystem, and it didn't create one around it. So there was really no extensive internet and apps world, etc., that wasn't there to help it actually create its product. And so it failed not because of the lack of genius, which it had. These were really geniuses that created it, but it failed because it didn't have an ecosystem around it. So today we have what has been created, the iPhone or the Android phone, the smartphone, is actually a combination, a remix of all these various different technologies that at one point or another rose and were created, and now they've been combined. This is what I mean by remix. The idea of remix is, of course, that you combine different tracks from music to create a new song. So in this case, essentially what Steve Jobs and Apple did was pull together all these different pieces that existed in other products and for other uses that were developed sometimes by the defense industry, and then created a new product from it. So in a way, a new innovation actually doesn't come from just a brand new idea on a clean sheet. You're always standing on the shoulders of giants, and so you're always actually recombining ideas from existing players into something better. Now, today, the smartphone world exists only because it has this extensive ecosystem of application vendors. So if you didn't have that on your iPhone, the reason why the two major iPhone and Android products became so successful was because they had this ecosystem of applications that were able to be written to it. And if you step back to when the Apple iPhone was created, you'll recall perhaps that Apple had a very strong strategic partnership with AT&T right off the bat, because it needed, in order to start up its ecosystem, it needed this important partner to make sure that it can be available around the nation. And after that, it could get other partners. So you can see here already, there's a little bit of a preview of what it takes to make an ecosystem successful. And sometimes it takes the proper sequencing of the partners. Get one, and then others will come later, is the idea. And of course, not only are there telecommunication partners in the case of smartphones, but there are hardware and other software partners that make the components that go into the iPhone. So again, the iPhone is a great example, I think, of one ecosystem in the world of smartphones. And I think it's worth thinking about that the smartphone world has all these connections amongst itself, but within the smartphone world, there are at least two competing ecosystems. You have the iPhone world and you have the Android world. And so when we talk about an ecosystem, the way I think about it is it's not just all the networks in the spaghetti chart of your industry. It actually is the subcomponents of that spaghetti chart that in a way are the clusters that compete against each other. So I think about this as a question of one group competing against another group. So you need many partners very often, because basically the components that you need, or the services that you need, or the markets that you need to access are multiple, and you can't do it with one partner to reach them all. So the concept I've been using in the past, in my earlier book, is called a constellation. So you have a constellation of partners that around you can compete with another constellation. And I think that today, basically, that's the idea around an ecosystem, or at least the way I understand it and the way I'd like to try to argue for it today. And these constellations, or these groups, compete against other groups, as I just mentioned. Here's an early chart. Again, this is from the very first book. So this is a 1996 edition. And it shows the competition between different standards of computing at the time called the RISC computing, reduced instruction set computing. Those of you in the semiconductor field or computer field will know what this is, and the rest of you don't have to figure it out. What it is different approaches to basically doing the processing that takes place in a microprocessor. And so what you see here are that they were competing groups. And the group around Sun, which was the Spark standard, and the group around MIPS computer system, and then the group around Hewlett-Packard, and the group around IBM, the PowerPC. So each of these groups had their approach. So we call this, in a way, a platform. Now, the word platform today has a slightly different meaning, and I'll discuss with you what it means to have a digital platform. But this is a technology platform. When you have a technology platform, it essentially means that basically all the people in the group kind of decide to work to the same code, to the same standard, to the same technology. And together, they can fill all the pieces of the puzzle that need to be created in order to compete. So what you see on this chart are the semiconductor firms, their systems firms, there were software firms that also joined the standard or joined the computer platform in order to make it work. And this is one example of competition of one group against another group, ecosystem against ecosystem. Another one would be a totally different world, but it's really the same concept. This is not very mystifying. The airline industry. So we have the very well-known constellations, the Star Alliance and SkyTeam and One World. And each of these constellations, you might say it's not as fuzzy as ecosystems is talked about today, because it's actually tied with specific existing alliances. And we'll talk about organizational structure in a minute. But basically, these are, again, competing groups in the airline world. They each try to fill the puzzle that needs to be completed in order to compete against the other players. Finally, the example that I've been using already of smartphones, this is the Android constellation. It's not the Apple one. So the Android constellation or ecosystem, again, is one that's composed of different pieces in the value stack, right? So it's a value chain of some sort, but it's not as if each of these players contributes and gets bought by the other in a sort of supply chain mode. It's more of a stack where they all have to work together in order to get success. So that is kind of the broad example of what an ecosystem is. And the basic idea is that these firms work together, right? These firms have to be rowing the same direction, and that's what is going to eventually get you to speed up and win over the other ones. And you have to avoid that the ecosystem pulls apart at the core by having very different conflicting interests. So I hope that gives you maybe the basic idea of what they are. And again, it's not very mystical. It's basically multiple alliances in order to create a complex multi-part product or service. So let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of what need to go right. And as part of that, what are network advantages? Because that term, I think, is very common today and is very important in understanding ecosystems. So going back to the basic 5 steps that I talked to you before, and basically we're going to kind of go counterclockwise, starting from the goal through to the other components. So the questions that come up for every ecosystem that are in a way reflective of those 5 steps is, first, how do multiple partners create advantage? Why do you need multiple partners? And the example I'm going to use for that, if you look at my little video screen for a moment, is from poker, right? If you have one card, it's really not worth much, right? It's only one card. It's when you have the combination of cards like this, and now you suddenly have a royal flush. You see that? This is what you'd like if you're playing poker. So what does this mean? This means that the ecosystem has to have in it all the right players, almost in the right place, in order to create value, because one player by itself cannot create value. And that's, I think, the essence of why you need to have an ecosystem and how you manage it. How do you need, what do you need in terms of the players? As I showed you already, certain specific players. How many do you need? Sometimes it pays to have many of the same. So again, if I have one card here, that's not going to do much. If I have maybe 4, okay, I'm doing well. What if I have 15 of these? Okay, that's not a poker play. But basically, it means that sometimes more is merrier. And in many industries today, having multiple players is actually an advantage. You have to be careful about that, because it means that there could be also a lot of friction between these players. But think about that as a partner mix question for any ecosystem. How do you organize the group? Well, as I mentioned already, a platform is one way to do it, but a supply chain is essentially another form of ecosystem. And you can also orchestrate directly. And I'll give you an example of that as we go along. But just think about the basic idea. When you form an alliance, You have to have value, you have to choose the right partner, then you have to organize and create the structure of the alliance. Same thing with an ecosystem. Create value by having the right partners, multiple partners if needed, and then how do you organize that ecosystem in order to make it, again, reach its goal. For ecosystems, there is the additional kind of problem, which is how do you get it going? It's a daunting task, and very often people think about this as a chicken and egg problem. I can't get the ecosystem going because there's no value yet until I have all my partners there. When the partners are all there, then we have value. If I don't have value, I can't attract the partners. So it's a chicken and egg. Do you first attract the partners, or do you first create the value so that you can attract the partners? As you saw earlier, the example I gave you of the iPhone, Apple basically formed a very specific targeted alliance with AT&T in order to get it started. And once it got started, others would join, and then everybody was clamoring, of course, to sell the iPhone. So this is a very specific question about how you create an ecosystem and have it growing. And finally, this happens with normal alliances, mergers, acquisitions. What do you actually get in return? What is your return on investment? The way we think about this in strategy is the question of capturing value, not just creating value, which you do at the beginning, but then capturing value. And this is very tricky. I'll give you again some examples of that. Again, we have examples of ecosystems, maybe that have been very successful, but that have not created value for certain players. And so I think you want to be careful not to be one of the players that contributes but doesn't get value out of the ecosystem. So these are fundamental questions, 5 fundamental questions to ask for every ecosystem strategy. And how do you approach them? Well, I think that some of the basic tools that we've kind of known, this is example one of the tools from Remix Strategy that basically helps you select a partner. So business A and business B, they happen to work well together. Well, why? Because they each have certain capabilities or resources that the other needs and doesn't have. That same story applies for company A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and go on. It's the same basic question. What is it that I need in my ecosystem, and how do I get the right partners to contribute those pieces? Of course, it's in multiple. So in an ecosystem, it pays to kind of map this out. This is an exercise that I do with clients very often, and it has to do with basically mapping out, taking a white sheet and mapping out what is in your ecosystem now and what might be in it in the future. And importantly also, who are your competitors? What are your rivals doing? How are their ecosystems shaping up? And it's really an exercise in understanding what kind of partners you need, how many of them you might want, and again, what are the relationships between them and the friction that might be coming from them. So this is an exercise, again, the book talks about it quite a bit. Let's step back and talk about this idea of network advantage. Network advantage, network effects, network externalities. These are all the various words that we use in the strategy field. Essentially, it's the chart there on the right. All it is that as the size of the network grows, and sometimes not just the size, but the diversity, so it's a matter of who's in it, as that grows, the value of that network to each member grows. It could grow like this, like an S-curve or exponential. It's really not that critical to think about which way it's going to go. It can flatten off or not. But what's important to realize is that this value to the network is something that each member will experience. So we're not talking about the total value of the ecosystem has grown, like there's more sales in there or there are bigger companies in there, so the total has grown. That's not what this means. This means that as the ecosystem grows in total sales, for example, each of the players find it more valuable to it. And so if it's a player that wants to come in, it's going to be more attractive to come in when the ecosystem is larger, when the network effects, in fact, have taken place. And the network effects come from the points that are on the left of the slide. Basically, they come from complementarity, from scale, and from feedback loops. And the idea is that complementarity, look, if you have hardware companies, you don't have any software companies in your ecosystem, but you need them in order to be successful, then obviously there's no value there even for the hardware players. Once you have the software companies in there, there's complementarity. Once you have the electric car and the charging stations, there's complementarity. Once you have, any kind of computerized version of a car, for example, self-driving car. Once you have the mapping and the sensors and the car itself, those are complementary pieces. So if you have them all in the ecosystem, that's a much more valuable ecosystem than if you're missing pieces of it. Scale. Scale is a question of, are you getting value out of the differences that companies come together to create, or out of the number of companies? Like, how many players do I need to make this successful? Here, it's worth thinking about not just normal ecosystems, but some of the platforms that we've talked about. So for example, here are a few. So PC architecture, I've talked a little bit about. I mentioned it. We'll talk about it again. Phone network, we've talked about. What about Facebook, Twitter, eBay, Uber, etc.? Those platforms and ecosystems, they operate because there's more value to high numbers, right? If there are a lot of people on Facebook or on Twitter, it's more valuable for each one of them to be on it, and so it attracts more attention. With Uber or with eBay, there's also a scale effect, but it's a scale effect in a way across the ecosystem. The more drivers, the more users. The more users, the more drivers, right? Same thing with eBay. The more sellers, the more buyers. The more buyers, the more sellers. You see this kind of network effect take place in terms of scale, but the way I just described it, it's a feedback loop. So in system dynamics, this is a very common way of thinking about this. This is a positive reinforcing feedback loop, the eBay case, right? The more buyers, the more sellers, the more sellers, the more buyers. So you can see how this feedback kind of leads to more and more in both cases. So feedback loops, scale, complementarity. These are the things that you need to think about fundamentally about creating network advantage in your ecosystem and in your digital platform. We'll talk about that in a minute as we go along. So how do you organize this ecosystem? You have an idea of how you might create value. How do you organize it? Well, go back again to the fundamentals of alliance strategy and management to know that an alliance is something in between, right? It's somewhere on the spectrum here from the lower left to the top right. Usually it's basically a combination of contracts and equity that creates an alliance. Well, the same thing for an ecosystem. So in Remix Strategy, I explain how there's a spectrum of constellations. You might think about this as a spectrum of ecosystems also. That on the bottom left, you have basically very little collective decision making. For example, it's a portfolio of firms. Pharmaceutical companies have this very commonly, where they have many players, many investments, many small firms that they work with. Those firms don't necessarily have to work with each other. Sometimes they do, but they don't have to necessarily work with each other. That's a portfolio approach. If you move up the spectrum to the right, you get situations where the companies do relate to each other. So these platforms that I described to you around computer technology, those companies have to work together. Their software has to work with their hardware. And of course, different applications have to work with each other. Otherwise, again, the ecosystem won't create value. So in that sort of zone where it says web and star, that's sort of more common way of thinking about ecosystems today. But keep moving up the scale to the right, and you find things that are a little bit more hardwired, you might say. So you could have a consortium where different players actually own a piece of the consortium, or it could even be a joint venture. So things like Visa, MasterCard, or even Star Alliance. So Star Alliance and other alliance networks in the airline industry, basically the member airlines, own a share or contribute to the common player that becomes the common brand, and then they also form relationships with each other. You see that this is already much more hardwired. It's part of a structure. There's very often equity involved. In the case of the airline industry, the so-called joint ventures in the airline industry are essentially multiple airlines that together share their revenue and their profits and their costs after they have antitrust immunity. This cannot be done without your lawyers very clearing it. And as you go up the scale, you have, I think, probably harder and harder structures. But realize that managing an ecosystem takes organizing it. It doesn't happen automatically. And so there are three basic ways of organizing an ecosystem. The first is using a platform. And I've mentioned to you already the idea of a technology platform. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what I mean by a digital platform and how that works. There can also be orchestration, direct orchestration. By that I mean there is a sort of leading company or several leading companies that kind of help make all the others make their deals. This would be the example of Star Alliance, for example, and the other airline groupings, where the umbrella organization, in a way, helps establish some of the rules, but also helps encourage bilateral relationships between airlines. Because in the end, those bilateral relationships are the kinds of alliances that are going to create the seamless travel and the value that gets generated by the group. Finally, you can have a supply chain. You might say, okay, well, we know this. Well, you do. And in fact, supply chains are ecosystems. And we don't have to call every new modern ecosystem something so totally different from the past that we don't understand it and we need a whole new lexicon. When we think about supply chains, essentially, when you think about an automobile supply chain, you have, the OEM maker, and then you have underneath there that, first tier supply chain members, and then the second tier members. And essentially, each one of them are creating components that become subcomponents of the next level, and it eventually leads to kind of system integration. So this is a very effective way also of organizing an ecosystem. All of these are dependent on your industry. You can't just jump in and copy what the airline industry does, or what the automobile industry does, or what the retail B2B industry does. You really do need to look at the moving parts of your industry in order to know how best to organize that. All right, let's step back for a moment and think about this idea of using a digital platform. Now, with that, I don't mean a platform where all your allies, put their documents and you can communicate. That's partly it. But basically, a digital platform is a thing in and of itself. There are a bunch of excellent new books that have come out. I'll give you a reference in a minute about how to manage them. So the classic cases, of course, are Facebook and Twitter and eBay, Uber, the ones that I mentioned already. And more, there are companies that think about the digital platform as something that needs to be part of their strategy and needs to be part of their ecosystem organization. So let's think about what a digital platform is. It's anytime you have to log in and be a member, and as a member you have certain rules, and then you have some benefits. That's what the platform is. Now, the word platform, just like the word ecosystem, is really just a metaphor, right? Ecosystem is from biology, so that's a metaphor we're using in business. The platform, what is it? That's a table, right? A platform is basically a table. And so when we have a table, when we think about the digital platform, we have a table along which people can do transactions. And so the question is, what kind of table is it? What kind of transactions? And then what do you get from sitting around the table? So the first thing about a table or a platform is, how many sides does it have? We talk a lot today in the strategy world about multi-sided platforms. So if you have a platform, let's say the Facebook or Twitter example, where it's just one side mostly, it's consumers are talking to each other. That's almost a one-sided platform. The eBay and the Uber example are clearly two-sided platforms because you have buyers and sellers. They're different, totally different characters that need to contribute. And in all cases, advertising often comes in as a third element or as a piece of the platform, because that is a way that the sponsors of the platform find that they can, in a way, commercialize the value of scale that they created. So think about how many sides. By that I mean, how many different players do I need to come to the platform? Secondly, what are those network effects? The ones I just described. Is it that we need more of the same, or is it that we need more of the other side in order to create the feedback loops that get this platform to grow? And again, as this grows, that creates even more network effects, and that's the feedback loop. Thirdly, what are the transactions? When you form this platform, people come to the table, you got it to grow. Do they make a transaction right across the table, or do they just meet each other and go, like dating platforms? Dating platforms basically are there. They may be two-sided if you wish, but basically people meet each other and then they go off on their own. And there's no more transaction on the platform. eBay has different platform, right? They have the transactions on the eBay, and because of that, you can have warranties, you can have payments, you can have complaints, etc. So as a platform designer, it pays to think about not just how many sides, where the network effects, but what kind of transactions are you realistically going to be able to facilitate and manage and in some way maybe take a cut on. That's what iTunes does, right? iTunes is a multi-sided platform. It's got users, it's got media producers, it's got Apple in there, and as part of the iTunes deal, as part of the rules of being at the table, if you wish, the players give a commission to Apple, and that can be a very sizable commission. Fourth is the question of when you think about charging players. I was just giving you the example of iTunes. How much do you charge? It turns out, of course, that if you don't charge anything, if you just let people come in for free, that you get more, right? The easiest way to spread a standard, technology standard, or to grow a platform is to give it away for free. But then you actually don't get value, right? So the question is, somebody's got to pay for it. And in the strategy field, in that sort of new world of thinking about multi-sided platforms, we worry a lot about which side subsidizes which side. So for example, is it the employers that post a posting on LinkedIn, are they the ones who subsidize the platform so that the job seekers can join LinkedIn for free and find a job? That would be one way to think about it. And the kind of general rule here is that you charge the side that is most useful to attract other sides, and that in a way aren't turned off by being charged. If they're turned off by being charged, then of course they're not going to come. So in a way, you charge the side that can carry that charge more, and that subsidizes the other side. Finally, who captures value? This is something very important. I'm going to get to that right now. And as you'll see in the example that I'm going to give you, just being in a platform, just being in an ecosystem is not enough. Even if the ecosystem is very successful and as a group succeeds to create value, it doesn't mean that every member of the group captures that value. So we'll talk about that. I'm just going to leave you, it's in the PowerPoint that you'll get distributed afterwards, a couple of very good books, I think, that have come out on the idea of digital platforms, not ecosystems per se, but platforms, digital platform, technology platforms. So how do you grow this ecosystem? I already said it is a chicken and egg problem. And you see that in the cases of these platforms, right? If you just create a platform, nobody's going to be at the party. A party with nobody showing up is not a party, therefore nobody's coming. So it's a feedback loop. You want to get it started, and then you can grow it. So here's an example of a growth of a platform. This is the market share of the different smartphone platforms over the period 2009 to 2014. And what you see there is the dramatic growth of Android, not the iPhone. The iPhone is in there. The iOS is the purple. And it has a stable kind of share. And it's all the other phones that are being pushed out. So what happened here was that Android came onto the market with what we would call a very open system. One of the distinctions that you need to think about in your ecosystem is how closed and how open is it. And by open, I mean how easy is it for the players to join, not just the users, but the developers, the technology providers, the hardware players, the software players, etc. If you make it very welcoming, if you accept in lots of players, then you have a very open system. Apple in the iOS system is relatively closed. I mean, the players there are Apple and Apple and Apple, and whoever Apple maybe invite in. The player on the Android side, the Google's Android, are many, as you know. There are multiple handset makers. There are many software makers. There are versions of Android that maybe sometimes are diverting a little bit from each other. It's not as much a monolithic system as it is in the Apple case. So that openness is what helped Android grow beyond market share in terms of iPhone. So worldwide, certainly Android is by far the most popular phone. But the profits aren't distributed that way. If you look at this pie chart, it shows you that in the total industry profits of that time, basically Apple was capturing half the value of that industry. And the other half was a combination of various Android players. So Samsung is the leading Android player, but HTC and even BlackBerry is still in there in this particular chart. But what you see is that the left-hand side of that chart is being, in fact, broken up because we have such an open system. So in a way, openness attracts more players, but at the same time creates more competition within the group that makes it harder for the lead players to actually capture the value from it. So think about the design as a way to capture value, not just as a way to create value. And I'm going to harken back again to very, very early history, which is the beginning of the PC revolution. And I think this is just an important lesson for us to understand well and apply it to today's ecosystem. So the PC world really started around a triad. It's a combination of three players, IBM and Intel and Microsoft, and they each had relationships with each other that were alliances. So this is a triad alliance, and in addition to that particular triad, there were other players that joined with software and hardware to make this particular grouping work, because this grouping was competing against Apple, right? At the time, this was not the Macintosh yet. This was the Apple II that was basically the most popular business use personal computer. And IBM came in 1981, 82 to basically take market share away. And just as in the case of Android, IBM had to use a relatively more open system, using more players and giving them more roles than Apple did in its original play. But look at what happened over time. We started this way, and yeah, it's very clear that in terms of the PC world, that the IBM world won. You know, even today, the share of Apple computers in PCs is not over 15%. It's probably 10%, and much larger than that are what we would call the IBM PC world, even though in fact they're not made by IBM anymore. But notice what's going on inside that grouping of the IBM group. IBM is capturing very little value, and Microsoft and Intel really are capturing most value. And why is that? You would think that IBM being the largest player and Microsoft being basically a startup at the time, Intel also a startup at the time, how could they end up winning? And this is a real lesson in David and Goliath kind of alliances, because the Goliath doesn't always win. And what happened in the case of IBM is that, in fact, the IBM part of the puzzle, the IBM contribution to the ecosystem, which is basically the platform, got copied. It got reverse engineered, first by Compaq, and then it got copied by all the clones. And essentially, you could say that what IBM contributes to the party now has been commoditized, and it can be offered by many other players. Whereas what Microsoft contributes to the party never did get commoditized, and Microsoft is very clear in enforcing its intellectual property rights. Same thing with Intel, even though Intel has a slightly different story, because Intel does have other players that can make a chip very similar to Intel, like AMD today, and you know that today. But let me back up for a moment. So if you are one of many players of the same thing, like a utility player in baseball, you don't capture the value. If you are the most valuable player on your team, a pitcher or a slugger, then you capture value. Your salary is going to be higher. Now, take a look at what Intel did. Intel did what I call in my Remix Strategy book the Intel flip. I think it's an interesting case to look at, because it's unique, and it's part of what allows Intel to become so successful. When Intel created the first microprocessor and IBM adopted it, they had, as I told you, this kind of alliance and part ownership of IBM and Intel. But IBM didn't want to rely just on Intel, and it forced Intel basically to second source. This is very common in the semiconductor world, to have second sourcing. And what this tells you is that in the IBM constellation ecosystem, it knew it wanted to have multiple players that provide this very important microprocessor. And in this case, part of the deal was that the Intel architecture would be licensed to a number of other players, including AMD and including IBM as itself. So in a way, protective, right? So in this kind of world, IBM was the steering of this whole ecosystem. And in fact, Intel didn't capture much value. Even though it was the important architecture, it had to share the profits of the microprocessor with competitors. Basically, it had to come in with its own set of competitors in order to be accepted by IBM. By 1990, this had flipped. By the late 1990s, this particular arrangement of the ecosystem had flipped to the point where Intel, over time, as it has further and further generations, it closed the standard and it did not allow others to play in. And it was, in the end, the only one able to produce basically the Intel standard. AMD competing, but still the Intel standard was more proprietary. At the same time, the IBM side of that equation got multiplied, and you had all the clones come in. And so, as you could expect, in that late game, it's Intel that captures the value and not IBM. So think about these two options. When you have an ecosystem, Are you the player that gets multiplied by others, or are you the player that has a choke point, that is in a way the only one, the monopolist almost, inside the grouping, and it's your rivals that are in fact being commoditized? I think all of this is really part of understanding overall remix strategy. So I'm going to refer you back to my book for more on this, including a bunch of tools that I referred to as we went along. But there's a major chapter there on ecosystems and constellations that hopefully will be a useful thing for you. At the same time, the two LinkedIn courses are available, and on my website there is a page, one of the menu items is courses, and you can look for online courses and it'll tell you how to get to that LinkedIn course. And I recommend them to you. We've had basically thousands of viewers. It is something that gives you some continuing education credit. As far as I know, you can get a digital badge for it after you've taken it. There are quizzes involved. And so these are ways to, I think, learn further. And I hope that what I've given you today is a snapshot of more or less what's in the ecosystems and partnership part of the platform.